Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. AppSec likes to talk about supply chains and weak links, about threads and strings and lines of code. But as Spock noted in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, that pattern indicates two-dimensional thinking. After all, we need multiple factors to protect our credentials. We need almost a dozen factors to calculate a single CVSS score, and we need 1 million secure dependencies every time we install a single NPM package. Which means this week we talk with Janet Worthington about the future of supply chains, where to apply more security, and how to build more trust. Hit warp speed and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Security Weekly and CyberRisk TV are headed back to one of the biggest identity security events of the year, Octane 2025, put on by Okta, live September 24th through 26th from the vibrant city of Las Vegas. Octane 2025 brings together the best minds in identity, security, and technology innovation. And this year, we're pumping up the volume. Security Weekly will be on-site in full force, with Mandy Logan and Adrian Sanabria leading the charge. Get ready for a live-streamed executive interviews, exclusive on-site editorial coverage from SC Media, and brand new this year, a live-streamed episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. It's your chance to engage with identity leaders, dive into the future of AI security, and hang out with your favorite Security Weekly hosts. And here's the best part. Security Weekly listeners get an exclusive discount. Just head to securityweekly.com/octane, register, and use promo code OKTNSCMA25 to get your conference pass for $200. See you there. Tired of the endless cycle of cloud vulnerabilities? Avoid over 95% of CVEs with minimal container images from Minimus. No bloated base layers, no unnecessary packages, just what your app needs to run. Drop Minimus images into existing deployments to dramatically reduce your attack surface and remediation work. Maximum security, minimum effort. That's Minimus. Visit securityweekly.com/Minimus to learn more. This is episode 343, recorded for August 11th, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima, flying the Enterprise solo this week as we do a bit of a pre-record that I hope doesn't end up like a Kobayashi Maru scenario. But here, helping me to engage this topic, is Janet Worthington, a friend of the show and a senior analyst for security and risk at Forrester. She covers product security, software supply chain, open source security, and DevSecOps, all of which we're going to talk about shortly, and her background is in product management and application security. Hello, Janet. Thank you once again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Mike. It's always fun to be on.
It's fun, and this time I always feel like I'm obligated to make some science fiction movie references. So we'll see when you're here. So we'll see if I can get some Spaceballs in as well. So longtime listeners will understand the in jokes here. On the opposite side of in-jokes and maybe things that are Spaceballs like, I'm not sure, supply chain. You've got some research and a new blog post about supply chains. And supply chains are one of those areas that, in my mind, is this sounds unfair, but boring, but still very important. But in a way, one of the easier things to at least reason about from a security perspective. So that's going to be my hypothesis going into this conversation. But maybe to set things up, rather than just talk about supply chain in general, Janet, if we can talk about AI, let's start that, because AI is making everything in the news. I really just want to ask, is AI introducing new concerns? Do we have new things to worry about within the supply chain? Or is it just, maybe helpfully upping the priority and increasing the prioritization for how orgs need to pay attention to supply chains?
Oh, it's a really good question. And I'm going to have to say both, actually. So I think we were already struggling to get our hands around the software supply chain. And I think what we've done now is AI has kind of like put a lot of spice onto it. And what I mean by like the software supply chain is when we talk about it, it starts with all the development tools and deployment tools that you use.
Hmm.
But as you're developing, you're pulling in open source libraries, third-party components, you're calling APIs, and now you're calling models, right? And now with these models, you're using potentially different ecosystems, right? Maybe you're hosting it on Amazon Bedrock, or maybe, you're just making a third-party call out there, but it's not the same tools and functionality that you're used to. And so I think what that means is that, if you were already having a hard time cataloging all the open source software, all the third-party components that you had, this is just going to make it even more difficult. And so what we're seeing is we're really seeing it sort of call attention and in interesting ways, because now you have more people using some of these tools. So in the past, an IDE would typically just be used by a developer, right? You weren't going to have, somebody like a product manager like myself come in and start using, the IDE, for example. I had no reason to go into VS Code unless I was like maybe demoing a product or something. But now you've got like Cursor, you've got Windsurf, you have, all of these tools that let you, as somebody who's maybe not as, a senior developer, start playing around with code, starting to, even generate whole applications. Now, do those folks necessarily know that, when they start downloading JavaScript or they start downloading Python, there are certain libraries they should be wary of downloading, that there are certain permissions that they should or shouldn't be giving? This cursor shouldn't be giving Cursor, for example. And so now what you're now seeing sort of like a growth in like the software supply chain itself in terms of the number of tools, the libraries like PyTorch, but also the people who are using it and potentially
Okay.
are now somebody you have to kind of educate that maybe you didn't have to educate before on, wait a minute, like before you start downloading all these, like you said, a browser plugin, before you start downloading all these plugins to your like Cursor, for example, you need to kind of, you need to take a step back.
Okay. And so, yeah, and what I hear is that aspect of the attack surface is getting bigger. As you're saying, we have new people using it. It's showing up in more areas. And the type of asset is changing a bit. And the reason I say type of asset is that have an asset inventory. That's one of the easiest things to put on a checklist for like a new CISO or for an AppSec program. And it's one of the hardest things that for any company to accomplish in the first place and then maintain over time, let alone over the period of like 1 month, let alone a year or longer. In seeing the new assets, I want to tease out that aspect because you said like hosting on Bedrock or hosting, you're dealing with models, you're dealing with data, and as you implied, like MCP servers. These things perhaps are running on our systems with a lot of extra privileges, or why does the MCP server that interacts with my calendar have access to my file system to run rm-rf? Those do feel like things that are more difficult, maybe not more difficult to track, but are just more complex or new or different from just what's this package version. And is, I guess, if I'm saying this, does that still count as supply chain, or are we also just expanding into, other areas of just the broader SDLC concerns as well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think what you're bringing up is that, yes, I mean, we are things like Cursor, we are giving permissions to, like you said, the file system that we may not be thinking about or aware of, especially if we're, maybe not, we're newer, a junior developer or somebody like that. We don't think about it as closely. But like you're saying, there's also sort of like a new type of things that we're bringing into the ecosystem that we might not have before, right? Models is not something that, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, people weren't including LLMs into their applications. Sure, some people had ML models, but that was, less so than today where everybody's trying to shove AI into their applications. And so now you have another attack vector, which is the models themselves. And like you're pointing out, if you download an open source model from Hugging Face, like how do you know how reliable, how secure that model is? And, we've already seen, there was some research earlier this year that there are malicious models out there on Hugging Face. And they're hard to detect because, again, they're using new types of, it's the same, maybe the same kind of idea behind the attack, but it's of a new type of technology that's behind it that, the folks who are in defense and researchers have to kind of get their arms around in
Yeah,
order to
and there's
see
an
that.
aspect of, I'll draw a parallel of, we've also had malicious Docker containers that you can download, things like that. But to your point, I would say the Docker containers at least have some deterministic behavioral properties to them, or even just some patterns you can grep for. Here's an obvious IOC related to this malicious software, et cetera. Or there's deterministic patterns where maybe, the malware just sleeps for a minute, 10 minutes, what have you, assuming that the security scan says, the security scan runs for 5 minutes, says, nothing suspicious got spawned process-wise, this looks fine. And then 5 minutes and 2 seconds later, now the malware is like, aha, I'm going to run. The reason I brought that up is that, those are, what do you trust that you download and run? We've seen this in many other things. AI does seem to introduce that non-deterministic behavior. Like, well, it's probably going to respond in this same way to most prompts, to some prompts, but it would be very curious how you find a backdoor. And we saw that example when DeepSeek came out the beginning of this year, and there was a researcher, we covered it, who did BadSeek. You can't just go and grep through the weights to see like, here's how it's going to backdoor your code. So now throwing back over to you, this question is, if we also draw a parallel between humans, like me, will type and make mistakes, we used to call that typo squatting, probably still do. AIs can have slop squatting, or they can hallucinate packages. Does that make us have to rethink what our strategies are for these, for how we would have protected ourselves from typo squatting, or do we actually need some new strategies for slop squatting?
I think we definitely need some new ones. I think we need to strengthen the existing ones, but to your point, with something like slapscotting, where it's like it's consistently hallucinating, which is sort of, yes, we make mistakes as humans, but we're not as confident, and we're not all getting it from the same person. So this is like, it would be like one person who keeps on giving bad advice to everyone. If typically
Like
I'm just making my
podcaster.
own mistakes. Now you're like, and so I think that's part of it. To your point, is that we have to now adjust to what this new reality is, and the fact that we put so much faith. And I think that's something that we continue to see in the data, is that especially junior developers and folks that are new, maybe don't have years of experience, are more likely to just accept what AI says. So they're not going to go out and make sure that that library name exists. They're not going to go out and make sure that that library isn't vulnerable, for example, or that, as they're coding, they're watching it. We know senior developers are doing that. We're hearing, that more senior devs are, when the code's being generated, they do kind of watch and they look for quality issues and security, because that's just, they're trained, their brains are trained like that to already understand and pick up some of that. But I think, they're not, probably the volume is going to become an impact even for them, right? Even if you know this stuff really well, if somebody, like, I think Google said they have 30% of their code is now generated by AI. As an individual, if you're the senior dev doing code reviews, now you have 30% more code you have to look at, or whatever percentage is yours. That's a lot more code to look at. And it's going to be much harder to kind of differentiate quicker that, hey, wait a minute, I can pick this out. So I think it's, yes, you're right, humans did make mistakes all the time. We're expounding those mistakes, and we're being very confident about those mistakes, which I think leads us to saying, you must have your security from the beginning, because it's not something you're going to be able to kind of rein in after it's already out there. And to your point, things like prompt injection, that's a completely new thing for us to have to worry about and deal with. And some security tools today all have to kind of take the next step up. Even this, like some of the static tooling that can find some, injection problems if you're not sanitizing stuff, they still have to kind of grow in order to find new patterns, et cetera. And we're seeing a whole new host of tools come along to kind of try and help with some of the newer stuff that these tools are introducing.
And this is where we're starting to then obviously broaden into other aspects of that SDLC beyond just here supply chain controls. What did I download? And is this even safe to use in the first place? I'll do a very, very short aside to defend junior developers as well. I've said this as well, what you've just said about scrutiny of code. I think senior developers can still get lazy, have those mistakes, just in the sense that you can easily have like AppSec practitioners and the people writing your October Cybersecurity Awareness Month slides. Those same people could still fall prey to a phishing scam. So don't necessarily want to blame the user. And I know that's not where you were going. But the reason I'm jumping on that is that a lot of security controls shouldn't just quote unquote shift left or dump onto the end user as the fix for this problem. And here's where I do want to, speaking about users, want to bring in that idea of who's responsible for what within these scenarios, within the supply chain. How much of it should be the language maintainers itself? This is setting aside even memory safety. Is this a good language for packages? Does the language have a way to manage packages securely? And I don't even know if that's even a well-framed question there. But so we've got the language itself, the package repositories like NPM, PyPy, even just the GitHub, GitLab, where a lot of these packages, open source packages are stored, as well as then the orgs. So that's my long preamble to ask, Janet, who has what responsibilities in here in the sense of not that they should be just manually scrutinizing things, but where should they be building or could they be building better defenses for us?
I think that, again, it's going to say like everybody's responsible in the terms of like, I think just to kind of give an example that kind of illustrates what you're talking about is there's a registry called Open VSSX that's run by the Linux Foundation, which is a very reputable foundation. Yep. And, some of their practices, they make sure that, they try to make sure that things are secure and that, you can't spoof things, et cetera. I think recently, I think it just came out earlier today or yesterday that there was a malicious package out there. It was a similar name. So it was for when you're coding with Solidity, which is used for smart contracts. The name of the extension was very close. It was Solidity language versus just Solidity. And the attackers had managed to make it look like it had lots of downloads. And the way sort of the algorithm works on that particular platform was the more recent updated sort of got a higher score. And so it kind of pushed this package that the developers had just created like a week ago up higher and made it look, and they had obviously done some spoofing of some other stuff as well. It made it look legitimate. And like, that seems so unfair, right? I'm not spelling Solidity wrong. I spelled it right this time. And I'm not, but it's just, it kind of goes towards the fact that, it's the same kind of issues, but these are, to your point, like these are different ecosystems that people are using more of. And why is Open VSX so like a big deal? Now it's been around for a while. It's, it is an alternative.
That's a great example that's a great example of trust too, because what you're describing there is, no shade to Linux Foundation. They've been investing for several years in open source security. They're doing the right thing. And it is interesting to have, here's a signal that has a lot of downloads. It's very popular. Yeah. Ideally, the legit packages are so. Mm-hmm. But if that can be spoofed, that's not a cryptographic backed basis of trust there. But even with that, we've seen some packages that are signed or
Yeah.
that the downloaders don't check the signatures for, and those have malware in them. And there's the XZ utils of last year is a famous recent one.
Yeah.
And there's been others that have, especially in the NPM ecosystem. And that's why they've been trying to force all maintainers must have multi-factor authentication, because it doesn't matter that Janet is the package maintainer. We can trust Janet, but if Janet's, if your keys or your credentials are compromised and someone else is releasing this on your behalf. So it's these interesting trust problems that I'm rambling now. Help me out here. Is there a solution?
It's a good point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think the thing about OpenVSX that I think struck me too is that it is now the default for cursor. So now we have all of these things that maybe wasn't as on the attacker's radar as before, but now of course they're going to go towards that. And I think when we think about, there are companies like Sonatype, they put out software supply chain reports every year. They're saying that there are 7 million plus components in the world, and we're all using the same 10%. So everybody is using the same group. So if everybody's using the same group, it should be okay, right? Because everybody's going to be checking it. Well, that only goes so far. It means that those components have to be secure, and then all of those components that it depends on have to be secure. But it also means the attacker's nowhere to go, right? To your point about XC utils, that was a widely used, obscure, unknown library that was called, 3 levels down or whatever it was. It could be more than that by the Unix OS, but the point is like, did anybody know they even had that in their environment?
Right. And what was great about that is, did they even know it? And it's obscure, but not obscure enough that it wasn't used within OpenSSL or OpenSSH, which was the whole intent of why that was being targeted, which is a wonderful, I think, burst of creativity and clever thinking on part of the attacker. And so I want to start to shift now, as we're talking about responsibilities and perhaps even trust. We're going to get to what can orgs do themselves, because let's just say we can't necessarily trust who, or maybe they don't even to a degree care who wrote the code. They just need to know, can I trust this code rather than can I trust the writer, because it cares more about the code itself. And there's an SBOM in the room here. I've seen SBOMs been criticized as SBOMs don't protect you against SQL injection. It's a little bit of a straw man, but I've seen the misunderstanding of what SBOMs are they intended for versus what they're not intended for. So help our listeners understand. Do SBOMs help us with trust in this way? Are they more of the asset inventory we were talking about, several minutes ago? What should be the thinking around those? Can they help?
So I think you raise a really good point. Software bills and materials are great in the sense that they give you visibility into whatever component you're looking at. And that visibility is just that. You can look in and see what's being used, but it's not going to tell you the actual risk behind each of those components. You have to then take it to the next level and enrich that software bill of materials to get the information about known vulnerabilities in it. What type of licenses are you pulling in? Is this component maintained by one person who might go on vacation and never update it again? So I think that's what they do. Is they are not a silver bullet. They are something to help you start with the visibility. And I think in security, our first step is always discovery. We got to know what we have so that we can secure it. And I think that's where they start. And I think the quality of SBOMs is something that can be easily debated. There's a lot of times they only provide you the first level dependency, and then you have to go and figure out what that dependency pulls in. And I think in the, like you were talking about with like JavaScript and things like NPM and some of these other libraries, they pull in so many. When you download one,
yeah, that's my go-to joke. Yeah, exactly.
You get so many, you get hundreds of libraries that you didn't even know you just like watch them come down. There's so many. it's hard to keep track of all of them, right? And every time you pull one thing in, that could have a vulnerability in it today, or it could have a vulnerability, a new, it might not change, but a new vulnerability might be discovered in it tomorrow. So it's sort of, it just gives you visibility, but it's not the end point. And it certainly can't just be, I take an SBOM, I analyze it once and I'm done. It's something that you have to continuously monitor.
Ransomware, supply chain attacks, 0 days. Cyber threats don't wait, and neither should your defenses. With ThreatLocker, you're not just reacting to threats, you're stopping them before they start. Our Zero Trust endpoint protection locks down your environment with pinpoint control over what's allowed to run and what's not. No guesswork, no blind spots. Just proactive, built-for-now security that keeps your business moving. Want to see how a true default deny strategy works? Head over to securityweekly.com/threatlocker and take the first step towards shutting the door on threats before they even knock. And that's what I like about the sense that the SBOM will hopefully at least tell you what you have. It may have errors of omission, so you still need other ways of scanning. But if you're the joke about the silver bullet, if you're fighting werewolves, that's great. But if your worries are the Mummy or Dracula or one of the other classic monsters, you need something else. You get just rely on your silver bullet. It's going to fail you. I do have to continue in a half joking. We have SBOMs. It's the world of AI and LLMs. AI bombs, do those exist yet? Am I already behind on this?
People are definitely asking about them. And again, like, it's interesting when it comes to AI bombs or ML bombs, like, a lot of what the information is out there. So for example, if it's for an open source model, what will be the quality that gets downloaded? What you'd want it to have is you'd want it to have any components that it's dependent on. You'd want to know, like, the data set that model was trained on. You'd want to know where that model comes from. Like, is it a derivative of another model of another model? What's the license behind that model? You know, what do you have to worry about from that perspective? You'd want to know a lot of that data. That doesn't mean that data's out there to grab necessarily, right? So a lot of it today is dependent, at least for the open source models, on what's in the model card. And some of it is really good and some of it is lacking. And so I think that kind of makes it a little bit harder for folks because, you know, it's not as easy to kind of inspect a model as it is source code. And so I think that's kind of where all these new types of techniques come in to try and see, you know, can we get ahead of this somehow by, you know, it's a more of like a dynamic or, you know, sort of a behavioral scan that has to happen to kind of understand how it's working. But yeah I think if people are asking about it, I think it's important if you are buying a product, you should definitely ask about software bills and material and make sure that the AI components are in it. And if you're downloading an open source model, you'll definitely want to make sure you understand what's in it. There's one example that the AI SBOM Tiger team likes to talk about. It was a really bad data set. It was a public data set that everybody was using to train their models, and it had some very bad material in it. And the problem was, yes, people figured out that data set and they could potentially clean that data set, but how do you know if your model was trained on that data set? Now, that is really hard, and it makes it harder if you're not even trying to understand what's in the models that you're using. And, you know, some people will take the model and, you know, they'll do RAG on it. And so then, you know, maybe they don't have to worry. They wipe out like whatever the bad data was. But if you're not going to do that, if you're just calling a model, you still have to understand that. Yeah, and even if you are doing your own thing on the model, you're not training it or whatever, you need to make sure that you keep track of what the data was, right? I mean, you have to understand
that's exactly
what that was
why we want
on.
that SBOM, that you're talking about the provenance of not just who created this, who wrote it, but the provenance in the AI world of also the data as well. Do we have this that has been tainted for whatever reason and we need to move off of it, replace it, etc. You also mentioned there a little bit of like essentially vendor security, like when you're procuring the software, when you're obtaining the software, SBOMs can be helpful. Now, obviously, you're not, you know, open source doesn't necessarily go through a procurement process. But here I want to set up a part of the conversation about responsibilities and what individual orgs can do. So near the end of July, John and I covered reproducible builds from Google. And this is something that Google's doing, and ideally they'll be setting up through reproducible builds mirrors of software that is blessed or has higher trust, better provenance to protect against the Solidity type of attack you mentioned, the exautils, other types of those supply chain attacks. But not all orgs can do their own reproducible builds, nor is it necessarily a good engineering investment time if you're a small org as well. So after that preamble, Janet, what can orgs do, or what have you seen orgs do to try and protect themselves? So we'll predicate this that the package repositories are doing their best, and mistakes will happen, and orgs want to protect themselves from those mistakes or malicious actors that get a foothold into those packages.
I think there's a couple of things that I see folks doing. The first one is to understand the different risks. So, I mean, we've touched on them already, but there's the idea of CVEs or known vulnerabilities in open source libraries. Then that I think is pretty common now. I think people understand that that can happen, and it can happen, 7 layers down, for example, and you have to keep those libraries up to date. The second thing I think is, when it comes to malicious code and malicious packages, and I think that's a harder one to get your handle on because it doesn't, malicious packages don't advertise themselves as malicious packages. They look exactly.
If only we had that evil bit in there.
Like,
yes.
real packages, etc. And I think the two things you have to do is you have to do different things for both of them. Like software composition analysis tools can help you with trying to keep you up to date on known vulnerabilities, trying to make sure that your libraries are up to date so that if a new known vuln comes out, you're not trying to skip like 5 versions, for example, to get there, or update your Java server, which is out of date, for example. But there's also malicious package detection that we're seeing more vendors try to work with, and now adding malicious models to that. So are there tools out there that can do that? And to your point about repositories, we're seeing more people use an artifact repository as sort of like their central point of truth within an organization to say, don't go out and just download any library. Don't go out and just download any container image or any model. Go to this one place, and what they can do is they can sort of route your systems to do that, and then they can put like it's called a dependency firewall is sort of like the current working term for it, where it's basically trying to, anytime you try and bring down something bad, like a library, it's trying to say, hey, wait a minute, let me scan this and understand it a little bit better. And some of it, maybe it's using indicators to see like, can I say like, this is potentially malicious and quarantine it, or do I know it's bad and just block it altogether?
Yeah, and the best thing about that is that there's automation, because if there's any approach that's like, oh, well, AppSec team, tell us if this package is okay, or hey, AppSec team, we're the AppSec team, we're going to tell you what packages are okay, regardless of whether it's the direction is coming from developers asking or AppSec demanding and proclaiming, that manual process is going to fail. And I've seen those local artifactories or local mirrors, or even just a proxy. I'll add to that too, that they're at least helpful from a reactive perspective of, did we download this? Were we exposed to this malicious package in any way? So if you can answer with more confidence to prove a negative, which classically is a very difficult thing to do. Sorry, philosophy nerds, let's set that aside. We're just talking about AppSec nerds here. That's very helpful for your incident response team, for your security. Say, no, we don't believe that it's been downloaded. Here's the logs of how it would have been so. Another thing, though, that's very interesting that you said too is that version numbers, because there's also just an engineering discussion of, do we pin to specific version numbers or do we pin to latest? Because that pin to latest is what can get attacked by dependency confusion, or in the sense of, here is not version 1, here's version 1000 that a malicious actor was able to sneak in through some other type of compromise. If you're pinned to last, you're going to download that. So, I wanted to add that because that's also, that pinning is a very just engineering driven discussion, and it's almost a no cost. There's a cost to the discussion, but there's no extra tooling you need, and it's a very engineering driven type of solution. So I wanted to bring that up in the sense of, orgs shouldn't feel helpless. There are some, I think, basic things that they can do to help themselves here. So I'm sounding to myself out loud, being optimistic. And the conversations you've had, Janet, with these different organizations where you're putting this together, do you have optimism for the future of supply chain? How are you feeling based on this?
I think your point about automation is what I think drives the optimism, is the ability to be able to say, hey, we want to do things in this way, and if something goes bad, we're going to have validation in place, because we know things are going to get through the cracks. We're going to still have validation in place in our automated pipelines to do some of this checking just to make sure. And so before it goes out into production. So I think your point, and whether making the decision to pin dependencies, is a good one in terms of, taking the latest is not something that, it can cause problems. Like we were just talking about, the latest update doesn't necessarily mean it's the best update. But the great thing is about these tools is these tools will give you choices. And that's one thing I've seen more of these tools doing, is they're not just saying go to the latest anymore. They're trying to give you options. They're trying to, you can do this. If you do, there are still these types of vulnerabilities in it, and know that we have a confidence of X that is not going to break your build, et cetera. So I think, to your point, I think automation is key. I think that you can't have any one team be the gatekeeper, but you can also have guardrails in place in the DevSecOps pipelines that we've talked about before, that even if something gets in the door, that you can catch it before it goes to production. And I think that's what I'm seeing a lot of companies do. The one thing I'd love to see more companies do that I don't, is to really think about the tool chain itself. So we think about the software that goes through the pipelines, and we're understanding more about the libraries, et cetera. It's the tool chain, like we talked about the IDE plugins, but also, the build tools that you have, your pipeline tools. We don't scan those. We don't check
I see what you're meaning.
That
Okay.
those could be open source. Those can, or third party, for example. Do they have known vulnerabilities in them? Did you configure them correctly? Are you using multi-factor authentication? Like these kind of questions, I also worry about that. Like you're saying, it's more the boring stuff that happens, and you don't want. And to your point about having reproducible pipelines, part of that is making it so people can't tamper with them. How do you make sure something's tampered with? Well, you have to know what you're using. And so I think that kind of goes back to like the visibility aspect. You
That's a
have
great
to
point.
know what you're pulling down. You have to know what you're using. If you're buying, like you can buy DevOps pipelines from a vendor. Do you know what's in it? Do they know what's in it? So you have to, it all again goes back to visibility. And to your point about trust, it's really hard when you break somebody's trust. I mean, we've seen in our own research, it makes it that much harder to win back that customer.
Yeah, and that idea of trust even dates back to the 1980s paper from Ken Thompson about trusting trust and saying, hey, I have a compiler. Do you trust the code that my compiler compiled for you? Because it's inserting a backdoor. And he demonstrated this. And what's really cool is that we have reproducible builds that are trying to worry about I'll bring in SolarWinds. That hasn't come up yet in our supply chain discussion. But reproducible builds are...
I feel negligent that I didn't bring
exactly.
that up.
That's okay. We try not to just go to all the cliches here. But the point I wanted to break, because of that reproducible builds, is also trying to say, we built this, and this was the artifact and the hash that we recreated. Now let's build this for twice the price in two different places. To quote, Interstellar, if you get that reference. But the idea is that did everybody build the same thing and get the same result? If so, this is good. We don't have Ken Thompson in the background doing shenanigans to our code, which coincidentally, speaking of one of the reasons I brought in like the responsibilities of the language maintainers, Go in particular has been considering this type of problem as well. How do you bootstrap from a known trusted compiler to compile your next compiler and so on? Coincidentally, Ken Thompson was helping with that design process as well, and he has the chance to do the funniest thing in a year or two on some anniversary of that paper to say, by the way, Go folks. But yes, that's just a joke. Go is secure. He did not backdoor it. But that is. But I think that does help us bring, I think, full circle, Janet, to the idea of supply chain is more, what you've helped at least me appreciate better is it's not just the package itself. It's how do we trust the package? What are the areas of trust? Meaning what's in it, who wrote it, where is it hosted, how is it built, which is the provenance, the reproducible builds, and that those malicious packages don't have the CVEs like you're pointing out. So this was very illuminating for me. I appreciate it. This was a fun conversation.
Oh, thank you.
One of the things,
it's a complex topic when you start thinking about the supply chain.
It is a complex topic, which I appreciate you coming on and talking with us again about. And because you are a regular on the show, I think you know where I'm going right now, is that we're getting to the end of our segment. We do need that AppSec in 3 words. So what is supply chains only 2? So what have you got for 3 words, Janet?
Yeah, definitely. It was hard because software supply chain security is too many. So I'll go with know your AI dependencies.
No, wait, isn't that 4?
Well, if you put AI and dependency together, that could just be 1.
Okay. All right.
Well, I mean, I could say know your dependencies, but then would you know about your AI ones?
I'll retort simply with, do I care? But I care very much about this conversation I had with you. Do I care about much more applies to AI? But this was very fun. So thank you once again, Janet.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who's listening. This was a pre-record, so we're going to probably skip a new segment this week, and we'll edit this in later if we do have a new segment. So this is just a fun little Easter egg for those of you who listen to the end. Since you are here at the end, please do remember to subscribe. Check out the show notes, share about us on the socials, and speaking of supply chain security, check out Real Life by Michael Oakley. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.